Linda froze in the middle of the kitchen. It was 2 in the morning, and she had just come out for a glass of water. The apartment was dead silent, but the air temperature had just dropped 20 degrees in a second. It was freezing. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slowly turned her head toward the back balcony door. It was a large sliding glass door that looked out onto the dark city. But Linda wasn't looking at the city. Someone was standing on the other side of the glass. It was a girl. She was pale, impossibly pale, standing perfectly still in the pitch black of the balcony. She had long, dark hair that hung straight down over her face. But the most terrifying thing was her clothes. She was wearing a bright, blood-red dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. The girl wasn't moving. She was just staring right through the glass, right into Linda's soul. Linda couldn't breathe. Her throat closed up in sheer terror. She wanted to scream for her mother, but no sound would come out. She just stood there, trapped in the gaze of the girl in red. To understand how Linda ended up paralyzed with fear in that kitchen, you have to go back 3 weeks. Linda's family situation had become unbearable. Their old landed house was overflowing with extended family. It was too loud, too crowded, and there was zero privacy for a 20-year-old girl trying to study, or for her mother, Madam Lee, who had just retired and wanted peace. Madam Lee, a practical woman with neat hair that only showed a few strands of gray, decided it was time for them to move out. Just the 2 of them. They searched for weeks until they found this place. It was an apartment in an older complex in a dense part of the city. The building itself looked a bit tired, the paint peeling in places, but the unit they looked at was surprisingly spacious. It had a large living area, a decent kitchen, and most importantly, 3 bedrooms. The agent seemed almost desperate to rent it out, offering them a price that seemed too good to be true for the location. Madam Lee loved it immediately. She claimed the master bedroom at the end of the long hallway for herself. It was huge, with its own attached bathroom. Linda took the smaller room near the kitchen. Linda tried to be excited for her mother. Madam Lee seemed so relieved to finally have her own space. But from the very first moment Linda stepped across the threshold with her first box of belongings, she felt a heaviness settle onto her shoulders. It wasn't a physical weight, but a mental one. The air inside the apartment felt thick, stagnant. It smelled faintly of old paint and something else underneath, something copper and unpleasant, like old pennies. Linda brushed the feeling aside. She told herself she was just tired from the move. She wanted this to work for her mother's sake. They spent the first few days unpacking and arranging furniture. Madam Lee was humming as she set up her new bedroom, arranging her perfumes on the vanity. Linda tried to ignore the creeping sensation of being watched whenever she walked down that long hallway toward her mother's room. The strangeness didn't start with ghosts or monsters. It started with the temperature. Malaysia is hot. It's humid and sticky, regardless of the time of year. But inside that apartment, it was always cold. It wasn't the refreshing cool of an air conditioner. It was a damp, seeping chill that got into your bones. Linda would walk in from the blazing afternoon sun and immediately shiver. The cold seemed concentrated in the hallway, and specifically, in Madam Lee's master bedroom. Linda mentioned it to her mother a few times, suggesting there might be a draft or a problem with the insulation. But Madam Lee just waved her off, noting it was nice to not be sweating for once. But soon, Madam Lee stopped saying it was nice. Within a week, Linda noticed a drastic change in her mother. The vibrant, energetic woman who had just retired began to wither. Madam Lee stopped humming. She spent more and more time sleeping in that freezing cold master bedroom, yet she always woke up looking exhausted. Her skin, usually healthy, turned a dull, grayish color. The few gray hairs on her head seemed to multiply overnight, and her eyes lost their spark, replaced by a glassy, distant look. Linda became seriously worried. She would sit with her mother at the small dining table, watching her push food around her plate without eating. Linda gently asked what was wrong, urging her to see a doctor. Madame Lee would just shake her head slowly, murmuring that she just wasn't sleeping well. She noted her dreams were heavy, filled with confusing, dark shapes. Then, Linda saw the bruises. It was morning. Madame Lee was reaching for a coffee mug, and her sleeve rode up her arm. Linda gasped. Covering her mother's forearm were 3 large, ugly purple marks. They looked like finger marks. Deep impressions, as if someone had grabbed her arm with intense force. Linda grabbed her mother's hand, demanding to know where they came from. Madame Lee pulled her arm away quickly, pulling down her sleeve. She avoided eye contact, mumbling an excuse about bumping into the wardrobe in the dark. Linda knew her mother was lying. Those weren't bumps. They were grip marks. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted from uncomfortable to menacing. Linda started hating the nights. As soon as the sun went down, the apartment seemed to wake up. Linda would lie in her small room near the kitchen, staring at the ceiling, straining her ears against the silence. She heard them almost every night. Footsteps. Heavy and slow. They didn't sound like her mother's light tread. These sounded deliberate. They would start in the living room, then move slowly down the long hallway. Thump. 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 Linda would squeeze her eyes shut, her hands gripping her blanket tightly. The footsteps would pass her door, continuing down the corridor. They always stopped at the same place. Right outside Madame Lee's master bedroom door. Linda would lie there, trembling, praying that her mother had just gotten up to use the bathroom, trying to convince herself the heavy footsteps were just her imagination playing tricks in a new, unfamiliar place. But deep down, she knew something was walking in their hallway. Something that wanted to get into her mother's room. The tension in the house became unbearable. Madame Lee was now spending almost all her time in bed, growing weaker by the day. The bruises were spreading to her shoulders and back. Linda was terrified, but she felt helpless. Then came the night of the light switch. It was late. Linda was sitting in the living room, trying to study, the only light coming from a small desk lamp. The rest of the apartment was in shadow. Linda jumped, her heart nearly stopping. The main hallway light had just flicked on. No one was there. Linda stared down the brightly lit, empty corridor toward her mother's closed bedroom door. The silence was deafening. Slowly, trembling, Linda stood up. She had to turn it off. She walked toward the switch on the wall. Every instinct screamed at her to run back to her room and lock the door. She reached out her hand. Her fingertips were inches from the switch. An intense, violent chill blasted through Linda's body. It wasn't just cold air, it felt like a physical wave of pure malice passing right through her skin, freezing her blood. It was so intense it felt like an electric shock. Linda gasped and snatched her hand back. The cold pocket of air lingered for a second, then dissipated. She didn't sleep at all that night. The next evening was when she went to the kitchen for water and saw the girl in the red dress on the balcony. After what felt like an eternity of staring at the pale figure through the glass, Linda blinked. When she opened her eyes, the balcony was empty. The girl in the red dress was gone. Linda couldn't take it anymore. The fear was eating her alive. She knew whatever was happening was killing her mother. The next morning, Linda waited outside the apartment complex. She spotted an elderly neighbor woman, someone who looked like she had lived there for decades, returning from the market. Linda approached her, desperation in her voice. She begged the woman to tell her about the apartment they were renting. The neighbor's face went pale when Linda mentioned the unit number. She looked over her shoulder, as if afraid of being overheard. She pulled Linda close and whispered the truth. The apartment had been vacant for a long time before Linda and Madam Lee moved in. The previous tenant was a young woman, about Linda's age. She had lived alone. The neighbor noted the girl had been very troubled, very depressed. Nobody knew why. One night, about a year ago, the girl couldn't take the pain anymore. She committed suicide in the apartment. Linda felt sick to her stomach. She asked where it happened. The neighbor pointed a bony finger toward their unit. She whispered that it happened in the big room at the end of the hall. The master bedroom. The room Madam Lee was sleeping in right now. The room where the temperature was always freezing. The room where the bruises were appearing on her mother's body. And then, the neighbor added one final, sickening detail that made Linda's knees buckle. She whispered that when the authorities found the poor girl in that bedroom, she was dressed in her favorite outfit. A pair of bright red silk pajamas. The realization hit Linda like a physical blow. The girl on the balcony. The red dress. The coldness in the master bedroom. The bruises. It was the previous tenant. She was still there, in the room where she died, slowly draining the life out of Madam Lee. Linda didn't even say goodbye to the neighbor. She ran back up the stairs, bursting into the apartment. She ran down the hallway, ignoring the freezing cold air, and threw open the master bedroom door. Madam Lee was lying on the bed, looking pale as death. Linda grabbed her mother, shaking her awake, crying and yelling that they had to leave right now. They didn't pack. They didn't clean. Linda grabbed their passports, their wallets, and the clothes on their backs. She practically dragged her confused, weak mother out of that bedroom, down the hallway, and out the front door. They left the door unlocked. They left the furniture. They left everything. They stayed in a cheap hotel that night. Within 2 days of leaving that apartment, the color returned to Madam Lee's face. The bruises began to fade. The life came back into her eyes. They never went back. They lost their deposit, and they lost their belongings, but Linda didn't care. She knew that if they had stayed one more night in that apartment, the girl in the red pajamas would have claimed another soul in that master bedroom.
Hi, if you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. To ensure you don't miss the continuation, make sure to hit the notification bell. Thank you.